should we try and get going?
Sure.
Continue, sorry. All right, so hopefully everyone has seen the meeting packet and has that electronically in front of them, or otherwise has access to it. If you don't, it's on the CAB webpage. So we tonight's meeting, Michael's going to be the scribe, and thanks to John, who hopefully will be joining soon. Oh, hey, Courtney. Just getting started. Welcome. And I believe that Michael is up for tonight, so thanks in advance for that. Our next meetings are going to be March 17th and April 21st, same time, 6 p.m. And the first order of business is for us to review and make sure that everyone's okay with the minutes from the last meeting that John had put together. Were there any questions or input on the minutes for those who are able to review them?
Looks good.
Okay.
No questions on the minutes, but I just wanted to confirm, I think you said April 21st for that meeting. Is it the 21st or the 14th that week? I think it may have been changed.
I'm seeing it in our agenda as the 21st.
Okay, I probably have it wrong, or I have it
No, I
doubled
think
in my
you're right,
calendar.
Scott. It says in the meeting minutes, April 14th. In the packet you sent out, Kate.
It should be the 21st is the third Wednesday, which is when you usually meet. That's probably school vacation week. So,
Oh, right. In
sometimes-
in the clerk schedule, it says April 14th.
Oh,
So,
okay. That was my mistake on that. But yeah, the meeting should be, your regular meeting date would be the 21st.
is that school vacation?
It is.
Okay. Do folks know if they have conflicts already for that, the week of the 21st?
I do.
Okay.
Not currently.
Yeah, I don't have a known conflict currently, but it is a couple months out. So maybe next meeting we can confirm if we need to move it. Is there anyone who has a concern with if we moved it up to the 14th or whatever? I guess it would be the 14th. No. Okay. All right, let's confirm that next meeting and see if other plans have firmed up and if in fact that week could be difficult. Okay. So I will, Courtney, is that, was your comment on the minutes a motion to approve the minutes?
Sure.
All right, can I
I'll
get a
make a motion
second?
to approve.
Second.
Ruthie. All right, we need to vote, right, to approve the minutes. So if everyone could raise your hands, either virtually or on camera. All right, I believe that is a universal approval of the minutes. Thank you all. Okay, moving right along. Let me get back to my agenda here. So just a couple things from me. I received an email a while back from, I believe it's Heather Bout, who is part of the middle school building committee. And she was reaching out to all of the chairs of a variety of different committees to let them know, just provide a couple of updates on the progress of the committee, as well as to basically invite any committees that are interested in hosting a building committee member to they're basically proposing a listening tour. And so I just confirmed with Kate, because I know Kate's part of the sustainability committee, to make sure there wasn't necessarily overlap, but she thought it was a good idea to have someone come in and basically, give us an update on the project and allow all of us to ask any questions. Obviously, I'm sure we'd be focused on, the net zero aspects and other sustainability elements that are in the planning process, and really just make sure that we have our voices heard by whatever committee member is able to attend. So I did reach back out to Heather and say that I thought we'd be interested, and I gave her the next meeting dates. I just want to, if anyone has any thoughts or concerns or any feedback on that, happy to talk about that now. But I think based on other topics that we have, hopefully we can work that into the next month or two, knowing that this is kind of ramping back up, and it's best to have our input earlier versus later. But if anyone has any thoughts or concerns, let me know. All right, hearing none. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Just chiming to say it sounds like a great idea. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
And then just the other thing I wanted to highlight is, and I haven't mentioned this in a while, but just the opportunity to, to try and participate or view other recordings of other committees in town. I know I haven't been very good over the last couple of months of doing that. And, I think it helps us kind of stay a little bit more connected to some of those committees that we may have interest in. I know, Warren had mentioned having some interest in the transportation committee, which I believe has been on hiatus for a little bit. And I know I had talked about trying to connect with the planning committee. So I'm going to try and be a little bit more proactive going forward in that. But I just encourage all of you to if you have, I know it's tough. It's all about time and making time to kind of look at that. But with the Zoom reality that we're in now, I think that it also makes it a little bit more flexible, because you can actually, if you can't attend, you can still look at the recording and maybe identify opportunities to engage. Warren, I did see your hand up.
Yes, yeah, I did listen to a couple of the meetings of the Transportation Committee. They were interesting.
Great.
I had nothing dramatic to report, but I wonder if we're going to do this, whether we should put on the agenda for one of our meetings an opportunity for people to report on what they've learned from these different committees. Otherwise, just all goes into a black hole.
Right. No, and I think that makes total sense, and probably should be something that we try and move forward with as part of a cadence, I guess. Yeah, we don't necessarily want to put people on the spot if they haven't been able to attend, but at the same time, we do probably need a forum for folks to update who have been engaging with other committees. So I can work with Kate on maybe building that out into the next couple of agenda, maybe a couple meetings out, and would encourage folks to let me know if there's a specific committee that you're going to engage with, and we can kind of put down folks who might be able to provide an update on what they've learned. That was all that I had in terms of my specific updates. I know that we're going to hear a lot more today from Kate and Alice on the RMI project, which I think we've been talking about quite a bit, as well as what's been happening at the state level with the climate legislation. So we'll hear about that. And I know Kate's going to be talking through the greenhouse gas inventory, and we've also got time for follow up on John's rec presentation. So we've got a lot on the plate. So I'll kind of hand it over to Kate now for her update, which I believe is also kind of a quick one this time.
Yeah, thanks, Jake. I didn't do a written update because as I was going to write it, I realized that pretty much everything is going to be covered later in the meeting. But just a couple things that are ongoing. As Jake said, the middle school building committee is moving forward on the feasibility study. There's actually a community forum tonight. So I I didn't invite you all to that since you're here, but I'm sure there'll be some more of those. And so I think it will be good to have a listening session with middle school building committee, so you can learn from, I can keep you updated, but the listening tour that they're doing is the architects are kind of giving a presentation. So I think it'd be great for you guys to be able to ask questions of the designer team. The climate legislation saga continues. Can't even quite remember where it was when we last met, but the climate bill that was passed, that was then vetoed, the new legislator sent it back to the governor, and he has proposed amendments. So as far as I know, they're in this back and forth phase, and hopefully they will get some kind of bill passed. But I will keep you up to date as I learn more about that. And then the other planning process that's ongoing is a library sustainability plan, which is also having community forum tonight during our meeting. But I think you all are pretty up to speed on that planning process. And there'll be a draft plan coming out soon. So when that's out, I'll be sure to share it with you all, so you can give your feedback on that before that's finished up. So that's it for me for a director's update for now.
Great, thanks, Kate. And we will, unless there are any questions on or feedback on Kate's update or mine, we're going to keep moving right along. All right, so let's head into the RMI update. Who wanted to kick that off? Was that Kate or?
Alice is pointing.
Alice is pointing
at probably
to
where my
Brian, but
face
on my
is
screen,
her
but
screen.
probably
Yeah.
everyone has a different person.
I think
that
that
pointing
means
to.
it's me, which is fine. So you all are very up to date on what's been going on with the RMI Accelerator program. But technically the program has ended. They've wrapped up all of the sessions that they've been doing with communities. And we did a final presentation to the group and heard from all the other communities, which was exciting to see that a lot of other communities are following the same strategies that we are. So I really think there's power in numbers there, which is exciting. So we're still moving forward with our 3-pronged strategy, which is a non-binding resolution, a home rule petition, and green zoning. The non-binding resolution was unanimously approved by the select board on February 8th. So I just got the final signature on that. So that will be sent to all the folks noted on the resolution. So that was really good. The select board was very positive about that. And so the next step is the home rule petition. So that will be presented to the select board next Monday, the 1st of March, and asking, given CAB's support of that, the request from CAB to the select board to sponsor that at town meeting. This Saturday is a town meeting preview meeting where all the articles that are going to be on the warrant are presented. And so Alice is on the agenda to present on that warrant article on Saturday. So that will be included in the town meeting preview. And then on Monday, CAB will make the request to the select board to sponsor that for town meeting. So if you all are available on Monday at 4 o'clock, I haven't seen the agenda yet, so I don't know when during the select board meeting that will come up, but it'd be great to chime in with your support for that on Monday.
Hey, Kate?
Yeah.
I thought I saw in some emails that Linda was asking if we could push it to the 8th. Is that something else, or am I?
No, it was she asked if we could push it. It was gonna be we asked for this past Monday, and she has to push
I'm
it
sorry.
to next Monday.
Okay, I'm confused. Thank you.
No problem. So I think I'll let Alice chime in with anything I miss, but in terms of the ask for CAB, I think, as this goes to town meeting, there's a lot of outreach that is really helpful in gathering support and meeting with other committees and sharing the idea so that other committees understand why this is happening and why it's important and why they would want to support it. and just, helping with a communications strategy for getting the word out. So that would be the ask of CAB going forward, that, anyone who is willing to kind of go to committees or other community groups and share with them that this is coming up at town meeting, that would be really helpful. So Alice, what did I miss?
I don't think you missed anything. I have an ad. Just this past week, I think maybe a week and a half ago, our state rep, Tammy Gobea, and Jamie Eldridge filed a piece of legislation that would have the effect of, if passed, if it gets to the floor and all that stuff, it is an opt-in strategy for a ZNE building code. So basically it says, notwithstanding all the other things that get in the way of us doing net zero construction in new homes, this would allow communities to opt in. So we may be hearing more about this strategy as it goes along as well. It was somewhat of a surprise to us that they did that, but sounds pretty good. I can send a copy of that legislation that was filed if you're interested. I think, Kate, you may have a copy.
Other questions or feedback? I know that in other communities that have gone down this path, there's definitely been, and it seems like the natural gas industry is definitely pushing back and trying to advocate against, fossil fuel restrictions. So I think you just have to keep that in mind, that's there's potential for that. And I think there's also, some people will have real concerns about what that might, how that might impact them personally from if it's a residential point of view or at the commercial scale as well. So. Okay, we'll move forward. I plan on meeting on Monday with the select board to present the home rule petition, and we'll give you an update in the next meeting, if not before then. I think now we've scheduled some follow-up discussion time on the Rex presentation that John made at the end of the last meeting, and we really felt like, we needed more time as a group to talk through that. Kate had included John's presentation in the end of the meeting packet. So hopefully, if you haven't had a chance to kind of take another look at it, you can go ahead and take a quick look at that now. And just wanted to get folks' thoughts, based on John's perspective. I know there are a couple folks who raised alternative perspectives, so I think it would be good for us to, to raise those and have kind of a discussion around Rex and their role in the strategy for the light plant. This also ties in a little bit to obviously the inventory process that Kate's going to go through in our next kind of section. So who wants to start? Warren.
I have a question for John, which I understand a lot of your concerns, and I think you make a good point that just buying Rex may not be always accomplishing as much as it seems at first glance. But just in terms of greenhouse gas inventory, the convention is whoever purchases the attributes from a renewable energy system. The electricity they're using is electricity that has the emissions that are linked to the generator from whom they're purchasing the RECs. So I still don't see why, if we're buying RECs, we can't be saying that we have zero emissions electricity. Now, maybe that's not accomplishing as much as we would like in terms of leading to additional generation. But the convention, not just in Massachusetts, but nationwide, is that the electricity that you're using is linked to the RECs go with the electricity you're using. And if you're purchasing zero emissions RECs, you have zero emissions electricity.
Right. So, I mean, I would say I don't believe it is the convention. And Kate can chime in if she thinks differently, but under the global protocol that most cities, at least in the US, are following, so there's two ways to do an inventory, right? There's the location-based approach, and then there's the market-based approach. So if you and it's all focused on the electricity the emissions related to our electricity use, because that's not, those aren't direct emissions. We don't emit those in town. It's basically the result of all the generation sources that contributes to making the electricity. So there's two ways to inventory. So those location-based and market-based. So the way the light plant is, we've done it both ways in our town emissions inventory. I think the first year was location-based because it was based on a grid factor, whereas in the second year, I believe that we did it primarily based on the light plant's portfolio of generation sources. My understanding is under the global protocol that most cities follow, you're supposed to do the location-based, and you have the option to do the market-based. So that means you're supposed to apply the grid factor, and you have the option of showing the ostensible reductions you get through RECs in the market-based inventory.
Yeah, I guess I was coming at it from a different perspective, not the global greenhouse accounting perspective, but the energy market perspective in the United States. And the way all energy markets work in the United States is that the emissions of the electricity you're using are a function of whether or not you purchase RECs, and it goes with that. And the problem with using the global greenhouse gas standards, as you were suggesting, is that those were not developed with the particular features of the US energy market in mind. They're based on markets in other countries, in part, where they don't have the same system of RECs.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think so. RECs weren't originally created to be this marketable commodity, right, that you trade back and forth in terms of your organizational or personal emissions. I mean, it was meant as a tracking system for these utility grids, so that state regulators and the operators could track the attributes of the different sources of the electricity. And so within the grid, these RECs go back and forth as a tracking system, so that the utilities are required to own a certain amount of RECs to show they're meeting the renewable portfolio standard. So at the grid scale, these things go back and forth. And I would say when smaller entities start buying RECs and moving them around, they're basically moving them from one place in the grid to another place, but there's no net change just through the trading. What the theory is, when we count the RECs as an offset of our emissions, is that that by purchasing them and retiring them and taking them away from the utilities, that we have some market effect that leads to the addition of new renewable sources that then avoids, at least, or decreases, depending on what's going on, the emissions from the grid. So I don't think there's any incompatibility there, and I don't think it's based on that there's something about European electricity markets that's different than ours that means REC should be treated differently.
If I could just say one more thing, and then I'll let others jump in, and I'd also like to ask with a different question. First of all, when a REC is created, it can only be retired by one party, and whoever retires that party is the one who can claim that they are getting the renewable electricity from the generator who produced that REC. The reason I tend to be hesitant to move away from counting RECs as zero emissions electricity is they have been the central innovation causing the success of renewable portfolio standards in states across the country. And they've been the central innovation in getting businesses to invest in renewable energy. And the protocol and the standard is whoever retires the RECs can say they're getting zero emissions electricity. And I still can't see why we wouldn't want to be able to say the same thing. Now, that's not the same as saying we've accomplished X or Y or Z, but if we've retired the REC, no one else is using it, that wind turbine and those solar panels that produced it, we're getting the electricity from those.
Well, you're getting the attribute, not the electricity.
Yeah, the equivalent, yes. But.
Right. So, so I tried to make the point in the presentation that emissions associated with our electricity usage have to do with the aggregate emissions from the regional grid, from the network of generation plants that are across New England and some of the electricity that gets fed in from New York and Quebec. And so, if you think of that as, a big circle and your RECs are within that circle, Concord's within that big circle, and it's just moving RECs from one side of the circle to the other side. But the purchase itself doesn't result in any aggregate change in emissions to the atmosphere. And so you only are going to get a change if that purchase then has some kind of market effect that leads the utilities to go out and invest in new renewables in order for them to meet the RPS. But there's a lot of reasons why that wouldn't happen. If you're in a surplus market, then the utilities have no incentive to do that investment. And there have been many years over the past decade when we've had surplus markets. The utilities can also buy their way out. They can make alternative compliance payments. And so I'm not arguing against RECs. I'm arguing against counting them as an emissions reduction at the local level.
John, I have a question. First of all, just when I think I understand the whole concept around RECs, I end up starting over and over and over. And yeah. I get your earlier point about how RECs were conceptualized as a tracking mechanism and then morphed into this trading. And people who are arguing that makes sense often use RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, that many people believe, and depending on which side you're on, whether that was truly successful. if we go and look at this at 10,000 feet, so that we can try to understand this, what are the risks associated with adopting, a trading mechanism, a tracking mechanism? What, from your perspective, how is this, are we susceptible to making a bad decision depending on the direction that we go in? Because I think what I'm hearing from Warren's side is that if we're trying to maneuver businesses, right? And we can certainly say that businesses have invested in renewable energy as a result of this. Is that a good thing? So I think embedded in there is a question, but I'm not sure. Maybe you could, talk
Right.
to that a bit.
Right. So, I mean, a lot of businesses go out and buy RECs the way CMLP is buying RECs. And I would make the same argument there, whether that's a real reduction or it allows them to avoid doing the harder things to actually reduce emissions. And I think it's the same thing for the town. So I forget the exact numbers, but I think in our last inventory, something like about a quarter of our emissions are related to electricity usage. So if we're just going out and buying RECs on the markets, it's like we're wiping off 25% of our emissions through this purchase. But I would argue those emissions are still going up to the atmosphere because all you've done is taken the credit on our side, but someone else in the regional grid system is taking the emissions that we were, responsible for. So there's no net effect. And so, we could talk about this, and basically, I see there's no empirical way to resolve this question, which is also an issue for me too. Is I have not been able, and I've asked various economists, I've not found any study that documents that voluntary purchases of RECs leads to emissions reductions. It's basically a hypothesis that it works. I think there's a lot of sound economic thinking why it could work, but there's no solid proof that it actually works. And so I think for me, the risk is that it takes our attention away from doing the actual substantive things locally, because we have 25% less emissions that we have to deal with, right? Basically, based on the way we do our inventory. So I'm concerned about that.
I'm seeing Warren is eagerly wanting to jump in. I know you obviously have expertise in this area, so if it's okay.
The whole development of renewable energy in this country has occurred because of the purchase of RECs. Without the purchase of RECs, most facilities in this country, renewable energy facilities, wouldn't have been built and wouldn't be competitive. So it's hard to say that there's no emissions reduction from purchase of RECs, because companies have gone out and invested in facilities by buying the RECs from those facilities, and those contracts enable the facilities to be built. Right. And the same thing is the case in the New England market. So we have a system where a renewable energy facility produces two products that are worth value: electricity and an attribute that's traded out there in the marketplace. The fact that people are willing to buy that attribute in the marketplace is what allows renewable energy facilities to be competitive in situations where their power might otherwise be more expensive than conventional fossil fuel power. Right. Now, I don't disagree with what you're saying, that there may be more productive things we could sometimes do. There are maybe more valuable actions the town of Concord could take. But that's different than saying that you want to go away from the way the whole electricity market works and not count the fact that the person who's buying the RECs is the one who's getting the zero emissions electricity.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the nuance I would add to that is I don't think it's the purchase of the RECs that's driving the investment. It's the regulatory requirements that are forcing the utilities to make those investments on a much larger scale than what we can as a little town, right? And so what I'm saying is the town going out and spending $3 million, and for Concord, that's a lot of opportunity cost, I think, which is a whole nother issue. It doesn't affect the market, or if it does, if there's a year in which there's a shortage of supply, then it could marginally affect the market maybe. But there are all these sort of relief valves for the utilities, which I think that pressure doesn't amount to very much. And so, I'm not arguing that utilities shouldn't buy RECs. The RPS has been one of the most successful, most important policies in the country. And, the emissions reductions we've achieved in Massachusetts are largely the result of that and RGGI, but that happens at a much bigger scale. And our town going out and buying a small amount of RECs on the voluntary market, I think just does not have the effect that we think it does. It certainly doesn't have the effect of offsetting 100% of our electricity emissions.
If I just want to jump in and say a few things. I think just to reinforce what we heard from Brian Folds, and I think from the light plan a few meetings ago, I know that their preference is always to purchase bundled power that comes with the RECs versus unbundled, which I believe, John, you're supportive of that approach. I think I do agree with the concern about additionality, and I know there's both regulated and unregulated markets, and are you actually driving the new development? Like, is your purchase actually driving the new development? And I know there's a lot of companies like Google and Facebook and a lot of the others who spend a lot of money on renewable energy, who are really developing more specific requirements for projects to try and drive, that they're actually funding a new build wind farm somewhere so they can feel more comfortable with that actually making a difference on the grid. So I think there's opportunities to be more thoughtful about, even if it ends up being some sort of virtual power purchase agreement or whatever, that you feel like you structure the deal in a way that it's really adding new capacity versus just buying a rack off of an older facility. So I think that that's a valid concern and should be something that the light plan thinks about. And then just going back to the greenhouse gas inventory process, I know, John, you mentioned the city standard, GCP or something. And I think that the one complexity that like other cities outside of Concord may have that we don't have is, the competitive supply and folks who can opt into green power plans. And so they would have to do a market-based approach. I think you'd have to account for all of that. Whereas here, I think it's a little bit different because as far as I know, most everyone's sourcing their electricity through the light plant, right? So it's different in how we'd approach it. At the same time, I know in the corporate standard that you're required now to track both location-based and market-based. And so I think there's probably makes sense to show like, here's the location-based approach. And I guess I don't even know what that means for light plant, like, because they are buying, they can identify exactly who they're buying from, right? So why would we use the grid if we know exactly who they're buying from? But I think the market-based approach would allow for, when they're purchasing RECs, unbundled RECs as well as bundled. So just a thought on that kind of, I think maybe difference between Concord and other cities. I just wanted to make, that was all I had as far as points. I don't know.
I make one point in response. I think you raised two issues, one of which I think is much more important and valid than the other. The distinction between making a purchase that caused something to be built that wouldn't otherwise be built. That's really important. The distinction between bundled and unbundled is meaningless. You could buy bundled RECs from a facility that is up and running already. I mean, you could buy power and RECs from a facility that's up and bundled already, and you haven't accomplished anything. On the other hand, you could buy RECs from a project developer and not buy the power from the project developer, and your purchase of the RECs could be the thing that caused that developer to have enough money to actually get the project built. So the key variable, are you causing something to get built and developed that wouldn't otherwise happen, not whether it's bundled or unbundled. That doesn't really matter.
Yeah, well,
Good point. Thank you.
I mean, I would say it matters in the sense that the total incentive you give to the developer is what you're paying them for the power plus the REC. So, I mean, they're also getting tax credits and other financial incentives. And so, I mean, you'd have to look at, you know, there's always the issue of, well, is your purchase of the REC really pushing it over the edge? And I mean, I think it matters if you're doing these bundled deals, although I would agree if you're just buying bundled power and RECs from an existing power plant, it probably doesn't necessarily do anything. But there are a lot of businesses and institutions and cities that are doing these deals with new developers of new systems, new installations. And so that guarantee of buying the power and the RECs is, you know, putting them over the edge and making those projects possible. So, you know, there's that nuance too. I mean, I agree with you on whether buying bundled power from an existing plant really matters or not. But I think sounds like we're all agreeing that the idea is to get more new renewables onto the grid. And the question is, what's the best way to make that happen? I mean, personally, I wonder at the local level how much we really can affect the supply side of things, and whether our emphasis should really be on efficiency and electrification, as well as what we can do locally for, you know, solar, on-site solar in town, that type of thing. I mean, I think we heard from the light plan at the last, when they presented that, it's hard for them to do deals with renewable energy developers because we don't have enough demand. And so they work with this consortium of light plants, and that they work together to create deals. But I imagine that's not the easiest process to go through to, you know, get projects that are additional to really happen.
Ruthie, I know you've had your hand up, and then we'll go to Courtney after that.
Yeah, I think, so first of all, I'm not as knowledgeable as Warren and John. So, but, you know, at Tufts, we're looking heavily into, you know, virtual power purchase agreements, because we'll never be able to decarbonize and add enough solar panels to stop emitting. But the one thing that I'm trying to push is, where are we buying the RECs from? So when we buy them from New England, the grid is decarbonizing, luckily, over time. But when we buy it from Texas, where they're into coal and gas, right, then we're buying a REC that's taking, you know, that's making a dirtier grid cleaner. And so I think, you know, and there is additionality. We're not buying an existing wind farm in Texas. We're buying into a new solar farm in Texas. So for me, there's an additional value in cleaning up a dirtier grid, which it's harder for us to do in New England. And also everybody's doing it here. Like, you're competing with your neighbors, you know, where not as many people are doing it in Texas or in North Dakota, you know, where there's a lot of, and so I think that's a piece that we could consider in terms of, if we're going to buy a REC, which is just an accounting thing, it's not a thing. We're not really getting the electricity because it's somewhere else. We're not physically getting the electron. It's still over there, wherever it's created. We're just buying this like pretend, value of something. Maybe we should buy it from a place where the grid is dirtier, and so we're doing more.
Yeah, I mean, in Cambridge, we used to buy wind wrecks from other communities, but we stopped about probably 8 years ago because you could buy those wrecks for like $1 per megawatt hour. And there's I have a couple of papers I can send you about this if you're interested, but when you compare that financial incentive you're giving to those developers with that $1 purchase compared to the incentive they get from federal tax credits and other things, it's inconsequential, right? You're just sending them extra money that they don't need. And so in that sense, I think the argument's even stronger. If we're going to buy RECs, we should be buying Class 1 RECs from New England because they're much more expensive. But the RECs you get from other parts of the country, like in places like Texas, they're so cheap that I think it doesn't matter and it doesn't make sense to count those as emission reductions. But I think your point about affecting a dirtier grid does make sense. And MIT did an interesting deal, which you probably know about, a few years ago, along with Boston Medical Center and the Post Office Square folks, where they invested in a new solar farm in North Carolina. But because that's outside our grid, they then had to sell the power into the wholesale market there, but they retained the RECs. But then you could argue that that investment actually reduced emissions, and it doesn't matter that the emissions reduction happened in North Carolina because it's going to the same place. I've talked to one economist who questioned whether that is really a good idea or not, but to me that kind of deal makes sense. But it's a substantial investment they made, right? And they bought both the bundle power and the RECs.
Right. I mean, I just have to say one last thing, which is the fact that it's so expensive here is a problem, not an asset, right? We've created a situation where it looks better to buy it here because it's so crazy expensive to build here, where it's not crazy expensive in Texas. Like, if you think about that, like personally, I just can't agree with that. Like, I can't agree supporting insane expensiveness just to make it more valuable, So, right. I mean, I think it's true, right, that probably the tax credits, because there's so much land in North Dakota and Texas, that it's not the same as here, but just to buy it here because it's more expensive, because we have so many restrictions, like, I just can't, I have a hard time buying into that. So anyways.
Courtney?
This has been fascinating. I know a lot about water and not a lot about power. So this has been really helpful just to hear the conversation and to get some education in this. And so I say that I don't know that what I'm going to say is all that useful in making the decision whether we include the RECs in our footprint. But I guess what I was hearing, John, and kind of in the conversation between you and Warren, the kind of the importance of the message that including the benefit, if you will, that we might get from RECs in our footprint would send to the community, I guess. And so is there a way to, agree to disagree, but I don't know, somehow still get the message across that, maybe energy efficiency is equal to or more important than just where we're buying the power? I don't know. Maybe that's not true, but that I think we're always going to have this argument, or at least for the next couple decades, right? Maybe, I don't know, that we're going to have this issue of RECs and to count them or not count them. But if our goal is to reduce or get people to change behavior in the community, that's I don't know, is there a way to message it, I guess, that maybe makes the most sense?
I mean, I guess what I would say is, I mean, to me, what matters is, are we able, through our actions in our community, able to reduce emissions to the atmosphere? And so obviously we have to encourage and support residents and businesses and organizations in town to make the effort. You know, but if we say that buying RECs is a way to do that, to me, it takes off the pressure, I guess, to do the other things that really matter. And so unless we can make the case that encouraging people to buy the RECs matters in terms of the ultimate goal of reducing emissions to the atmosphere, then, you know, I'm not sure that's the way to go.
Can I say two things about this? And one is, I share your concern that this might not be the best way to spend our money to have an impact on emissions. And we should look at whether there's a better way to spend the town's money to have an impact on emissions. But that's a different thing than saying that if we bought those RECs, we shouldn't be saying that we're getting zero emissions electricity, because that's what we're getting. A comparable example is if we had a polluting factory in Concord and we forced that factory to close and to move to Lincoln, the Concord emissions would go down. And we'd have to acknowledge that Concord emissions have gone down. That's the way you count it. But that has not necessarily accomplished anything in terms of global emissions, because now we've just moved them to Lincoln. And so if we buy those RECs, we're getting the zero emissions electricity, but that isn't necessarily what we should be best spending our money on. Now, I also think that I disagree with John that it has a bigger impact than he argues, but it doesn't necessarily lead to a one-to-one development of renewable energy. You know, if you buy 500 megawatts of megawatt hours of RECs, you're not causing 500 megawatt hours of new renewables to be built necessarily, but you're causing probably some to be built. And I would like to have a discussion. The town should have a discussion of what's the best way to spend our money to have the biggest impact on emissions, and not do that separate from our emissions accounting, because otherwise you get into the situation where you feel good if you force the factory to move out of Concord and move to Lincoln.
Right. Right. Well, I mean, that's basically what I'm arguing, is by buying the RECs, we're just moving the emissions to Lincoln. So,
some of them, but not all of them.
But I don't think we're moving them to Lincoln. I think
it's not to Lincoln per se.
Not to Lincoln, but I think we're keeping our factory emitting, but we've paid Lincoln to shut down a piece of their emitting factory. That's what we're doing, right? We're not changing our emissions, but somehow with our money, we're paying Lincoln to, shut down one of their engines, their coal burning engines. That's what I think we're doing. We are lowering the emissions in the world, even if not in our town.
Yeah, well, I mean, you're not really leading. When we buy the RECs, we're not shutting anything down, right? We're just moving the attributes.
It's a little backwards,
for the credit.
Right. I mean, I would note that when we do outside of bundled RECs, when we buy RECs, we're still paying a fossil fuel generator or a nuclear generator someplace for the electricity. So fossil fuel generators are still getting incentives from the town. I mean, I asked the Greenhouse Gas Management Institute about this, and I mean, they wouldn't take as strong a position as they do on voluntary purchases of RECs, but they also argue that it's not a one-to-one reduction, and that they suggest a method where you could quantify that. It's not an analysis I would know how to do, but it's like some kind of marginal emissions analysis. And so you would come up with a way to calculate the partial credit. I mean, and so to Courtney's point, that might be like one way you do it. But I guess I agree with Warren. I think the issue is we should, talking about Rex is just mind numbing. And I think that, the central thing is for the town to figure out, well, in terms of supply, what's the best thing that we could do to affect emissions? Obviously, I don't think buying Rex is the way, and I don't think the light plant thinks it either. I am worried that, just by buying them, we're solving 25% of our problem on paper, but I don't think it's really there. So, I think ultimately we should come back to having a discussion about how to affect supply, given what the tools we have in Concord.
I
I
wonder
know
if-
we just have 10 minutes or so left. And I think it would be good for us to think about what some of the next steps are, and how this ties into any feedback we might want to provide to the light plan, or, to Alice or Brian or other board members. So I don't know if folks have thoughts on that. I think Courtney was going to jump in, or someone else was jumping in. So let me take another comment or two, and then we can see if we have any alignment on what next steps might make sense. Like what does this mean for CAB going forward? Yeah, Courtney, go ahead.
I like the possibility of, maybe taking a look at that partial credit analysis, especially I think we've got two factions right now, where one part of the group really feels strongly that should be accounted for, and one, group doesn't. But then I think consistency. So what I see in the two footprints that we have right now, we changed the method. So we didn't change the method. Oh, okay. Maybe I read that wrong, but so that's good. So I think just being consistent with that will help. Whatever we decide, whether it's partial credit, no credit, or full credit, like that will help us to show the trend over time. And that's, is important. But I don't know, I would be interested to see, or to think about that partial credit potentially more. And maybe that refinement happens over time, that we figure out how to better take that into account. But then also separating the reporting from the generation. I think figuring out what conversation to have with the light plant about, their future plans. And I know they were working on that strategic plan last week. We talked with them, but what input can we as a group have into that? Would be an important next step, I would see.
Jake, I don't want to jump the gun, but I know Alice has to hop off for another meeting. So I don't know if you want to take her comment before she has
Sure.
to
Yeah,
go.
I was just about to call on her. Thanks, Alice. Go ahead.
Great, thanks. So I think this is a really insightful conversation. And I'm thinking that this would be a valuable conversation to have with the light plant, with the light board. Honestly, the light board does not have the deep energy knowledge that this group does. And to hear this conversation is in some ways enlightening as we think about a good strategy, because the light board helps to set policy for the light plant. And we vote on decisions based on, on whether we should invest in this project or that project. And, we chose not to invest in the biomass project out in Springfield a year ago. But this is a good discussion. I think the light board needs to understand Rex better than we currently do, and then what the rest of the board thinks as well. So I'm wondering whether this would be a conversation we invite John and maybe Warren and members of this board to come to the light plant meeting the light board meeting, so that we can have a robust conversation about Rex at some point in the nearer future. And that's one point. The second one is, we talk about in-town generation of supply. We ought to be thinking pretty hard about supporting on-site solar at the time of construction of the middle school. Because there is an example where maybe money is better spent investing in the on-site solar at the middle school than it is in buying any more RECs. And that's a 1.5 megawatt or whatever size generation site. That's all I had to say.
Thanks, Alice.
I mean, if I can, it seems to me there are two maybe steps that we could take. So one is Kate does the inventory. So, and we get to advise Kate. So, I mean, one thing would be to decide at the last meeting, I think Brian Folt suggested doing the inventory on both the location and market-based approaches, which I don't think it's a big lift to do that because you're just applying different emission factors. And so that at least you would get that comparison, right? And then the other step is noted the light plants working on updating their strategic plan. So if there was to have a way to have input on that in terms of how they approach supply, and I mean, I would say not to have the discussion about RECs versus in terms of how they get counted, but to have the discussion in terms of what's the best things we can do to get new renewables installed.
Yeah, I would just say I would agree. It would be best. It would be ideal if we could, if CAB could agree on either some principles or some position on how best to drive additional renewable capacity in both in town and or regionally. And like, if we can get Warren and John and everyone to kind of align on what does that look like, and also recognize that we're trying to balance like the costs of this and the realities of those challenges of developing renewables in New England, where we don't really have great capacity from wind except in certain areas, and solar is more difficult with winter, and so it's like we're competing against other resources that are a lot cheaper. Like it's a lot cheaper. It's really cost effective to develop wind in Texas. That's probably why RECs are so cheap down there, because they don't, they can develop those without the additional incentives. Anyway, so I don't know if there's like a subgroup that wants to try and think that through about like how would we position this with the light board? Can we get to a place where we feel like there's a position we can take as a group, or is it more just presenting the concerns and different perspectives? I don't know. Warren, do you have thoughts on that, or others in the last few minutes we have?
No.
Okay.
I think there are sort of two different standards here. One is how to move the town towards zero emissions. And the other one is how to reduce global emissions. And they're two different things. You can move the town towards zero emissions by buying RECs. You can move the town to zero emissions by pushing that factory out of town to Lincoln. But that's different than saying you've accomplished as much as you can in the outside world. And it's a question, can we get people thinking about, hey, we're willing to make a trade-off. We're willing to reduce the town of Concord's emissions in terms of a greenhouse gas counting system a little less, because we're going to take a step that actually is going to have a bigger impact in reducing global emissions.
I mean, I would just say, I think we should be aligning the town, what the town does with emissions with what's happening on the grid. It's if they're two separate, I mean, I understand your point, but if they're two separate things, and it seems like we're then diverging from what really needs to happen in terms of reducing emissions from the atmosphere to the atmosphere. But
I just throw one thing in there. I mean, if the grid in New England is going to decarbonize, right, then it doesn't matter if we put our factory in Lincoln or not, because
right.
20 or 30 years from now, that factory will be emitting less, period, because electricity is greener, which again goes back to they're not decarbonizing in Texas on their grid. And therefore, although it's cheaper because land is cheaper and there don't have as many, crazy, interesting requirements that we do, you could see it as a bigger impact to a grid that is not getting cleaner. That's it.
And I guess maybe we can end with the end in mind, which what I heard is that we are all in agreement that much or most, if not nearly all of our resources are devoted to promoting higher levels of efficiency and electrification of buildings. That was sort of in the very, very beginning. We seem divided on the rec side, and frankly, I'm not sure either, to be perfectly honest, but I think the recommendation of having some more clarity from the light board might move us forward. I think that's a good recommendation, Jake.
You're muted.
You're
Jake.
on mute.
Sorry. I think if nothing, my daughter was like screaming in the background, so I had to mute for a minute. She like stubbed her toe or something. It was like really loud. So I think we need to shift gears, but maybe let's think through what conversation we can have with the light board. And I think just raising some of the concerns, even if we don't have a specific recommendation, as Alice mentioned, might be valuable. And I think if we try not to dig into the gory details of rec accounting, that would be better. We've had enough of that today, at least for one night. Okay, so
Sorry.
even though we just said I just said rec accounting, now we're going to the greenhouse gas inventory, which includes all sorts of accounting. And thank you, Kate, for all of your work on this. Kate is gonna walk us through her 2019 inventory.
Yes, here it is, the moment you've all been waiting for. I'm just gonna change my screen. Bear with me so I can actually see you and hopefully my slides. Okay, so I think you will be pleased to see a lot of this. It touches on a lot of the points of the discussion you just had about decarbonizing our electricity. What's the impact of that? What kind of message it all sends to the community? So I have a bunch of slides, bear with me, lots of charts and graphs. I'll try to get through it as efficiently as possible so we can take your questions. So here's what I want to cover today. I want to share with you, I did a 2019 inventory, as you all know, the results of that inventory, what that means for progress towards our 2020 and 2050 goals, some kind of other general trends and takeaways that come out of having these now 3 years of inventories, and what the next steps are. So 2019 inventory, it was completed by me using the MAPC greenhouse gas inventory tool that they released last year. They put this together, I think, to help communities, especially small communities that are trying to do greenhouse gas inventories that may not even have any staff, never mind multiple staff, who want to set greenhouse gas reduction goals like Concord has and many others have, but didn't have the capacity to actually do the inventory. So it's a really great tool. It is pretty straightforward to use. It follows the global protocol for cities, which is what our 2008 and 2016 inventories followed. And it does use the market-based emissions factor approach. That's their recommendation. I did read through the global protocol guidance, and I think, John's right in that it does say you should report the location, but it also gives this market-based option. And my perspective is that a lot of communities are using the market-based option because it allows for you to account for changes that you make to your electricity supply. So not just municipal light plants, but also community choice aggregation that a lot of communities are doing. Using the market-based approach allows you to account for that. And I think there's also, the inventory guidance it's guidance, and it throughout the guidance says that where you have more local data, you should use more local specific data. So that's the approach we're taking with the vehicle inventory, for example. So that's the methodology it follows, but I do have the location-based comparison for you. So never fear, you can see that as well. So here's a snapshot of 2019. This is just the raw numbers and how it breaks down by sector. The breakdown by sector is not particularly different from previous years. Most of our inventories and many other communities look like this, with somewhere to 60 to 70% stationary energy, which is buildings, about 30% transportation, and then 4 to 5% waste. And here is the location versus market base. So I use the tool to adjust the emissions factor to just be the location base. So that's they have the Massachusetts factor that the state uses for their greenhouse gas inventory. And you can see the difference here is obviously in scope 2, because that's where your electricity plays in. In terms of the total emissions, the location-based method is about 12% higher than the market-based. And obviously the biggest piece of that is in the stationary. So that's the comparison. We can certainly include this in the report. But from here on out, all the other slides I have to show you are using the market-based method. So here's the kind of breakdown with municipal disaggregated. I put this in here just because the tool spits this out, and I get a lot of questions from people about what percentage is municipal, and it's a very small percentage, not surprisingly when you think about the entire community and the number of town-owned buildings and vehicles. But I think it's good that they have this broken out, because we do track our municipal energy consumption and emissions for green communities. So we are able to kind of pull that out. But you can also see kind of the breakdown of passenger versus commercial vehicles, public transit being the commuter rail, and residential and commercial buildings. Oops, I'm going backwards. So this is showing you buildings, honing in on buildings as our biggest source of emissions. This is buildings and fuel type. So you can see kind of, it's still similar to previous years, where natural gas is still a really big driver in our emissions. So on the chart on the left, it's going from highest percentage at the bottom to lowest at the top. So you can see that the bottom two bars are still natural gas, commercial, and then residential. And, as we decarbonize our electricity supply, obviously that percentage is going to get bigger and bigger for natural gas, even if our emissions are going down. So I have a couple slides coming up about the progress towards our goals, because that was kind of, beyond tracking our emissions year over year. One of the big intentions of this 2019 inventory was to measure progress towards our 2019 goal. So this is based on multi-year comparisons of 2008, which is our baseline inventory we completed in 2017. One of the first things CAB in its infancy advised on. The 2016 inventory, which was the most recent that we did at that time. But I have since revised it. So all the numbers you see going forward are the revised 2016 inventory based on your feedback on how to handle transportation emissions. So I will make an addendum to that 2016 report, but assume that's included in here, and then our 2019 inventory. So the kind of takeaway here is that, yes, we met that 2020 goal of reducing overall emissions by 25%. The total reduction was 29%. Between 2008 and 2016, that blue arrow that shows that reduction was 14%. And then in our recent, the 3 years between 2016 and 2019, we saw a 9% reduction. You also see reduction in each sector, steady decrease in each sector. When we had done the 2016 inventory, it actually showed an increase in transportation, but with the revision, it actually shows a steady decrease year over year. So here are the raw numbers here. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but just to see, how the decrease in emissions broke down between sectors. We saw the biggest decrease in the building sector. And if you look at the bottom chart, that just breaks out commercial and residential. And you see from 2008 to 2019, the reduction was pretty similar in both residential and commercial. So it's not, just one sector driving the reduction there. And then waste, there has been an increase. That's a little harder to parse out, mostly because we don't have great data for waste given the number of private haulers in town. But my best interpretation of that data is that it's showing an increase because we've had an increase in population. And so a lot of the assumptions are based on population. So here's a chart that I wanted to show because people will ask, and people ask me all the time, like, well, are we on track towards our 2050 goal? And I hesitate to say that a couple data points make a trend, especially given our previous discussion about decarbonizing our electricity. In 2019, CMLP reported 50% non-emitting to DEP, and that's the figure that we use in the greenhouse gas inventory. Once we get to 100%, then there's not going to be any more big drops in our electricity emissions. So I hesitate to say that we're like on track, because that, just because emissions are decreasing doesn't mean there's we don't need to make any changes. But I did want to show, this was the chart that was particularly compelling and really jumped out at a lot of people from the climate action plan to show, if we were to continue at the current pace based on the inventory we had in 2016, we're going to fall way short of our target of 80%. So I put a little dot based on where we are now to show that, we are below that target line. But like I said, I think I would hesitate to add a trend there that shows we are on target, but at least to show you kind of where we are. So I wanted to share a couple other trends just that in the data and digging into the data that I thought were interesting and you might find interesting, mostly about buildings, but then I'll share a little bit about transportation. So as I said, sector by sector, we saw a decrease, but the split between sectors remains pretty consistent. So we still see about 65% buildings and 30% transportation and 5% waste. When you look at the building emissions by fuel and sector, this is where you start to see the fuel switching taking place. You see a lot of fuel oil in our baseline that you don't see in recent years. And so this is no surprise to any of us. We saw this in the 2016 inventory too, that we're seeing a decrease in fuel oil and an increase in gas. So obviously those electricity bars will shrink as our emissions factor changes. But I think the kind of, even if you use your imagination and wipe those off the page, we're still far from our goal there. I also pulled out consumption because I think, this came up in your previous discussion too, right? Is that, decarbonizing electricity supply is only going to get us so far. There's still a real big role that efficiency has to play. And you can see here that consumption has decreased, but not dramatically. So if you look at it, this is another way to look at it. I couldn't quite decide which one was more useful. But if you look at year over year, you can see like the electricity consumption was pretty flat. You see an increase in gas and a steep drop in fuel oil. So again, that's that fuel switching. And just one chart on vehicles. So while an interesting trend here is that while our number of vehicles registered in town, and this is based on the assessor's database, and consequently the total VMT has increased, our emissions have gone down. And so I think this is really shows you the impact of efficiency standards and also a shift in the type of vehicles that are registered in town. So, changing in that vehicle mix and more electric vehicles and hybrids and plug-in electric. We just got new numbers that show we now have well over 500 vehicles with plugs registered in Concord. So that's been steadily increasing quite a bit. So I thought that was an interesting trend. So last, I'll just say, kind of the next steps for wrapping this up. I'm going to write up an addendum for the 2016 report rather than rewriting that whole report. Just explain what we found and why we made a change to those transportation emissions in that inventory. And then I'll put together a brief report summarizing the 2019 emissions. And then going forward, we had talked about continuing to track annually where we have access to the data. And it's actually not terribly difficult to get data from, obviously from CMLP, we can get that pretty easily. National Grid was pretty good at turning it around this year. So I don't see any reason why we can't continue to track annually. And given the ease of using this tool, we may even be able to just drop those numbers in and just see what it looks like year over year. Now that it's all set up, the kind of ongoing maintenance of it should be pretty straightforward. So I will stop there and see what questions or comments you have.
Thanks so much, Kate. Really great, and great to see that we're making progress. Open it up to questions.
That posted yet or available?
No, I was just finishing it today, so I
Okay.
send it around.
No, I didn't want to flip through some stuff. I actually have to leave in about 5 minutes, so I want to take up the questions, but I do have questions. So when you're ready to share it, there's some things I just want to take another look at.
John and then Scott.
Well, we let Scott go first because I've
Okay.
talked a lot.
Scott.
So I just have a question about, I guess for the business as usual or current trend lines, or maybe both of those, what are your general assumptions around electric vehicle adoption for those? Because, I think I think it's fair to say that, or fair to assume that, EV adoption is only going to continue ramping up over the coming years. And I'm wondering if you're sort of factoring in that, or if we're going based off of current rates of adoption for the Concord community.
Yeah, the business as usual in that is just based on if there's some population growth and nothing changes. So it's like if we did nothing and everything was status quo as it was in 2008 and Concord continued to have a slight increase in population, that kind of current baseline was just quite simply the pace we reduced from 2008 to 2016 if that annual average rate kept going year over year. So it didn't make any assumptions. We did back in 2017 when we did the initial 2016 inventory and the baseline. We also did a wedge analysis that looked at some scenarios of EV adoption, heat pump adoption, decarbonizing electricity supply, vehicle efficiency standards, and one more. There were 5 that kind of looked at different scenarios and what that would result in terms of emissions reduction. So we do have some of that, but I think I'd have to look back and see if our assumptions about EVs were even on par with what we've actually seen the last few years. And I think now that we've seen a lot more commitments from the state and federal level about EV sales, I'm sure that will probably be even faster than maybe we had assumed when we did that analysis.
Michael.
This is great information, Kate, and it was an enormous amount of work for you to pull together. On the buildings, there's a significant success in emissions reductions. Do you have a hypothesis of what were the intervention strategies that we did over that period to contribute to such a significant drop?
I don't know that I would say it was anything we did. I think it was just the switching of fuel from oil to gas. So I think during that time period with new construction, that was the preference, right? So I think you just saw that and kind of happening with the market. And, I think energy efficiency, plays into some of that. But I think the biggest thing you see is that switch between fuel oil and gas.
Well, and probably also the electricity factor.
Yeah.
Change. Yeah.
Yep.
Warren? You're on mute, Warren.
Great job, Kate. This is really useful. The one thing I question, though, are those numbers about fuel oil. I just can't believe that it's credible that higher percentage of the folks in town who are on oil in 2016 are not on oil now. I just, looking around my own neighborhood, 3/4 of the people who have oil tanks haven't gotten rid of them in the last 4 years.
So the fuel oil numbers are from the assessor's database. So it's the best data that we could get. I mean, it's not a perfect data set by any means. But that did jump out to me too. So there may be more to that story. I think that's a good observation. It does look dramatic.
Yeah, I mean, if less folks look around and see, is there evidence that higher percentage of the folks in town who've been using fuel oil to heat moved away from it in the last 4 years? There got to be something fishy about the number. Maybe it's possible that the previous number was elevated for some reason, but it's hard to see that the switch was that dramatic.
Does the assessor's database, how is that developed and updated each year? Is that looking at every home, or is it a portion of homes, or only those that are turned over?
I don't know the details.
Should be. I remember when I looked at the data, it's all homes.
It's all homes.
At least it used to be.
It's a function of how well the person going in doing the assessment records the data, right?
Yeah.
And I think we'll continue to have challenge with that, because as we see people transition to heat pumps, a lot of them will leave their oil system in, even though they may not be using it most of the time, or perhaps all of the time, but they may just not take that system out. So it's possible that then that would still be recorded in the assessor's database by Brian, that they have oil, but they may not actually be heating with it. In that case, it would be overestimating our emissions, not underestimating, which may be okay.
Would it show both sources on the assessors?
I don't know. I have to learn more about how we can better identify that. I mean, the benefit we have of CMLP is that they provide rebates for heat pumps, and we can access that data. So we know year to year how many people received heat pump rebates. So we could try to kind of compare those data sets and changes between assessor database year to year and heat pump rebates, and see if that seems to be reflected in there or not.
Is it maybe Michael would know, but is it possible to ask National Grid how many new connections have happened over some period of time? And that would be maybe a way to corroborate some of that.
I mean,
He's laughing.
I'm trying to see though, I think they share the number of customers so that would be evident in the number of customers.
My sense is as we get closer and closer to looking at eliminating the growth in natural gas, the corollary will be we'll get less and less cooperation from National Grid, but who knows?
Go ahead, John.
So on the year-to-year analysis, that's based on the market-based emissions, right?
Yeah.
And, I mean, it would be interesting to see how much difference when you apply the location-based factor, how much difference that makes. I mean, I tried to do it with the old inventory, but I couldn't pull out enough information to do it. I mean, you would still expect the electricity emissions to be going down with the location-based factor because the grid's been getting cleaner.
Yeah, the emissions factor has decreased. If you look at 2008 to 2019, I'm just realizing I didn't address your question, the question earlier about the location or market base for 2008 and 2016. While it looks like 2008 was location based, we applied the market base, but at that time CMLP was not retiring Rex, so there was no difference in.
Right.
So they're one and the same, really.
Right. Yeah, so you weren't inconsistent.
No.
Right. It's just that effectively it was location based versus market.
Right.
And then I mean, it's interesting that natural gas emissions went up since 2008, but then have flattened, look like kind of mostly flattened in between the last 2 years. But I mean, that's also concerning because that has to go down a lot, right? So,
right.
And then on transportation, how did you do the emissions in terms, you had to work with VMT, right?
Yeah, so we use the way that we've been tracking EV adoption has been using the assessor's database of registered vehicles with the VIN numbers and parsing out what types of vehicles those are from the VIN numbers. So we were able to do that. We just started doing that a couple of years ago. So we didn't already have the 2016, but I asked for the 2016 data and had one of my colleagues kindly ran that through the VIN analysis. So in terms of the vehicle counts by vehicle type, that was based on the assessor's database. The VMT data we have from the vehicle census, the last date they did that was 2014. So we were using the VMT per vehicle type from 2014. I looked at changes in that and tried to see if there's any potential trends or assumptions we could make about changes in average VMT, but there's not enough data to make any, I think, valid assumptions. So I just left the VMT per vehicle type the same as 2014 because that's the best available data we had. But because there are more vehicles, that means the total VMT in the community went up. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Now I remember we had this discussion about how you were going to handle that. We couldn't get the RMV data. I don't know if it's helpful, but I've been talking to people about the new Google Environmental Insights Explorer tool, which the communities have to ask to have that data made available. But I understand there's transportation data in there that's based on cell phone data. So basically they're tracking people's movements. I'm not sure I like that idea, but it may give you some data about number of trips and length. And they can apparently discern if you're walking or biking or in your car. I don't know if they can discern vehicle type, although I would be surprised if they can. But so that I don't know if that's worth looking at, especially if we're going to have trouble getting RMV data. I'm going to try to find out about it for Cambridge, so I can let you know.
Yeah, that would be good, because I do think that going forward, we can get that vehicle count and feel pretty good that that's accurate. But the VMT that we apply to that, it's hard to say, right? And even the fuel economy, the vehicle census had real fuel economy for the vehicles with the VMT, and so you start to feel like you're meshing together a lot of different data sets, which makes me feel less confident in the accuracy of it. So I think, for 2019, it wasn't too far off, but the further off we get from that 2014 date, I think the harder it will be to feel confident that that VMT by vehicle type is still reasonable.
Yeah.
But yeah, that Google thing is that would be how creepy, but potentially
It's happening regardless, so we'll just
That's right.
Regardless,
That's right.
right?
use
Let us
the
hold our
benefit
nose.
of it, right?
Yeah, I mean, they have emissions data, but then, they're using algorithms for building emissions, which I'm not too confident in. I mean, not to resurrect the rec thing, but I think it's interesting to look at the difference between the location and market-based factor, because it may be we're paying a lot of money for a very marginal difference because the grid factor is getting much better too, right? So it's another way to think about it.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the difference between the two, when you just look at the stationary energy, it's about 19% higher location based. So, and that, like I said, that's with CMLP's 50% non-emitting for 2019. Now, if that's 100%, obviously that changes a lot. But yeah, it is interesting to look at the comparison. And given that the 2008 inventory was basically equivalent to the location base, we can easily do that math to see where we would be if we were not accounting for that.
Yeah. Great. Well, that's a lot of work. It's very useful to see the numbers.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. Thanks so much, Kate, for that. I think if the fuel oil numbers are somewhat correct, I think it raises the importance of trying to get ahead of those conversions that we have left that people haven't transitioned to natural gas, and figure out how many of those can we get to go electric instead. And I know CSEC has been trying to tackle how do you approach that, and I think the heat pump brain cramp, what are the heat pump coaches that we're bringing on board?
Yeah, actually the website just launched yesterday, so it's a good for concordcleancomfort.org. We'll take you to the site on the town's page that shares the Concord Clean Comfort program, which includes heating and cooling coaches. So they're available to help with anyone who has questions about how heat pumps could work for their house, rebates, incentives. They're also providing quality control for any heat pump rebates that happen, to make sure that the installers are sizing them properly, so that residents are getting the most bang for their buck, and they're getting the right size heat pumps that are going to work for their home. And there's also weatherization rebates available specifically for ducts, which I'm told is really important for the success of your heat pump. So all of that is available on the new website.
I just had that consult today, actually.
Did you? How was it?
It was great. The guy was awesome. I mean,
Good.
he could answer all my questions, and we went through all the different, options and choices in my house. It was fantastic. And yeah, and he's around to look at the quotes, and I'm so happy, so excited.
We should get you to write a testimonial for
There we
the.
That's
go.
right, Ruthie. We need a case study from your house.
We're working on some case studies actually, so I'll sign you up, and
Yeah, no, I
when you're done.
No, I mean, he really understood like all the, complications, which was great because nothing is simple, and I definitely felt like he, was not like biased or anything, like sort of straight up, helping. I mean, first he said basically, what's your goal? Like, what's your goal out of this? I was like, wow, okay, good. So it was great. It was really good.
So is
That's
it a
good.
firm, Kate, that's providing the service for the town?
Yeah, it's Abode Energy Management
Oh, yeah.
that's partnered with CMOP.
Yeah.
But yeah, the goal is that they're there for you as the resident, not to recommend a particular installer or brand, but to help you look at proposals and understand all your options and make the best choice.
Yeah, Cambridge is working with them too.
Yeah, they're actually based in Concord.
Cool. All right. Any last questions for Kate on the inventory? Otherwise, I'll move to public comments. I think we lost a bunch of folks in the last
In the
15,
Rex
20 minutes or
discussion.
so. But for those who are left,
Well, I'll just jump in and say fascinating discussion, especially since I happen to have been on the teams who were who envisioned the Rex Market. In fact, this started, as many things do, in fairly innocent conversations. And it was as I think it was said, it was a policy design, or it was fitting incentives through a policy design. Ultimately, initially, I don't think the trading market value was fully appreciated. I mean, it's not that we didn't understand it, but it was, there were a lot of measures being employed to somehow, as I think Warren said, break through the impasse for renewables into the markets that had not yet recognized their value. But I think there were some really interesting conversations that, it was fascinating to hear it. You never, be careful what you ask for. And then I need to look at the inventory more closely because Kate, it's interesting. I was on CSEC when we were first looking at the impact of the assessment of oil in town. And that is an odd number. I can't imagine that success rate. I love it, but it just seems, there's got to be something that I'm missing there because I too see a lot of oil tanks that haven't moved. So, and while I worry about the move to natural gas, because I think that's just stranding an asset as we build more pipelines, ultimately, I still don't see that we've really changed out that many, I wish there'd been a March, but I haven't even seen as a select board member extensions of gas mains or gas lines that would equate this. So none of which is a criticism. It's just very interesting conversation. So thanks all.
It's helpful. I'm going to take another look at the fuel oil because and see if there's an explanation there. I mean, I think the one that looks most dramatic is the commercial sector fuel oil. The residential, when you look at the consumption, it's dropped, but not as dramatically. So I think it may be a difference in how that was accounted for 2016 versus 2019.
Mm-hmm. So thanks. And I don't want to dominate public comment because I don't know what I am, but I don't think I'm public.
thanks, Jane. Amity, did you have a comment?
No, not really. I learned an enormous amount, and you've given me a lot to think about with the earlier discussion, and also looking at the inventory is really fascinating. So thank you.
Sure. Thanks for joining. All right, well, we finished a little bit ahead of schedule, it looks like. Were there any other last items that CAB folks had, either earlier topics or anything else people wanted to bring up before we decide whether we're ready to adjourn?
Don't you think we should keep talking about Rex? For that-
Let's dig in our last 13 minutes.
No, somebody
Get
make
deeper.
a motion to adjourn.
We managed to scare off all of the public somehow.
I wouldn't take offense.
Thursday.
There's a public forum happening.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's the middle school. I think everyone wanted to join that. So, and there's 2 forums, right? So
Right, the library, I think library.
library
Library.
too. We've got
Yes.
lots of choices.
Boy,
Well, we can't compete with all of that.
No.
my goodness, really.
Well, I'm glad.
Jake, oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I'm glad I came to this meeting. It was so fascinating to hear the conversation about Rex. I was not scared off. I was on the edge of my.
Jake, I have a question and I think my question is and probably should be who I should ask offline about this, whether it's you or Kate or maybe both of you. But I was reminded in Kate, your inventory presentation about our 80% by 2050 overall goal, and was realizing, and you know, I'm sure this is a very dumb question, but I'll use my freshman committee member prerogative to ask it anyways, which is, you know, was there discussion when setting that goal around 80% versus something else like a net zero goal? And I'm guessing the answer to that is yes. And I don't want to have, you know, take the next 11 minutes to rehash that discussion. So curious if maybe one of you might be able to fill me in on that.
I don't know because that happened before I got here. That happened in conjunction with the creation of my position. My understanding is it was aligned with the Massachusetts Global Warming Solutions Act, which at the time was 80%. Obviously now it's net zero. So I think that could be a point of future discussion, but there is a report. The Energy Futures Task Force was the group that recommended the goal and creating my position. I think Jane was involved, a number of former CAB members were involved. So I'm sure that documents some of the conversations that happened at that time.
And I think
Yeah,
that's
I'm
on
happy
the
to
CAB site
speculate.
too, right? Sorry, Jane, but Kate, that Energy Futures Task Force report, I think, is posted on our web page as well as several other reports like the Climate Action Plan, et cetera. Okay.
I was going to say, I think that unfortunately, I'm looking at the group here and I know it's not full, but I think that the CAB has lost most of its former Energy Futures Task Force members to the light plant.
Yeah, Pam and Brian are
Right.
both
and yeah, Pam and
they're at the
Brian.
light
Yeah, exactly.
board.
So
Okay. All right, guys. Anyone want to make a motion to adjourn? Ruthie,
So move.
Warren seconding. Okay, we're going to vote to adjourn. Everyone is in favor. Thank you all so much. Have a good month.
Yeah.
And
Bye
we'll
now.
be checking in March.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks, guys.
Bye.